Chapter 1. London, Spring 1788. Thomas Bennet slammed his mug down on the wooden tabletop. "No more Collins," he hissed. He shoved the ale aside. The drink was vile, the company worse. "I do not know why I even agreed to come." He shook his head, disgust written in his features. "An olive branch, you say? To tie my daughter Frances to your son before she has even begun to learn her letters? We are not the royal family, sir, seeking a political alliance. Especially not to a family such as yours." "It is a rational plan, Bennet," replied the man across from him, leaning back and folding his hands on his lap. Josiah Collins was tall and broad-shouldered. His body was built for a life of physical exertion, yet he was a clergyman, in every way a stingy, unrelenting disciplinarian bent on punishment, not forgiveness. "A marriage contract makes everything easy. Your wife will never have a need to leave Longbourn." A cold shiver ran up his spine. "Fanny is young," he responded warily. "We have a great deal of time, and should something happen to me, you should recall I have a brother." He stood. "We will have a son, or James and his family will inherit, and then all connection to you will be severed for good." "Your brother is unmarried and stationed in India, a risky prospect at best." Collins stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Your wife is expecting, but she may have another girl." His voice was as smooth as fine brandy. "For the right price, I might be convinced to sell my place and break the entail when the time comes." Thomas placed his hat on his head. Fanny's condition was no secret in Meryton, which was why he had arranged to meet his cousin in London. It perturbed him that Collins knew. "You are not even the heir presumptive, Collins. You have no standing. There is no need to pay you anything." He paused, and then added, with just a touch of bitterness, "More importantly, I must believe that the good Lord cannot mean for a man such as you ever to be master of Longbourn." He bowed his head slightly. "Good day, sir, and goodbye." A fortnight later, Frances Bennet lost the child she carried when an illness struck down the entire household. As a result of a violent stomach ailment, the heir to Longbourn was born too early and could not live. To heap misery upon misery, their daughter was lost as well. He could never prove it, but Thomas was sure that somehow his cousin Collins was to blame. Oakley Manor, summer 1796. Daniel Wyndham pinched the bridge of his nose with his free hand. "Ellie already has too much freedom, Mariah. Really, what will you say when she wishes to attend Eton with her brother? We cannot allow her to parade around the grounds like a boy." Mariah Wyndham shook her head at her husband's exasperation.
"Where is the harm, dearest?"
she asked.
"We are in our own home."
She stood and took her husband's warm hand.
"She has been waiting more than a year to wear it, and she was very excited to show it to Richard and Malcolm."
"Mariah," he said warningly, but his wife interrupted him.
"Oh, Daniel,"
Mariah replied, waving her hand in the air.
"do not fuss. She is 4, and may I remind you, has learnt her stubbornness from her papa. If you forbid her to wear it, you will have a battle. If you say nothing, she will change her clothes without coercion, and I dare say will do so in less than an hour."
There was a chorus of young voices in the entryway, and Daniel followed the noise to the door of the drawing-room. His wife's Fitzwilliam cousins were visiting, along with their cousin William Darcy, whose mother had recently entered her confinement. They were all making ready to head out of doors. There was a great divide in age between the visitors and his children, but his nephew Malcolm, the future Earl, and the eldest at 18, did not see it as beneath his dignity to take his young cousins out to play. In fact, all 3 boys seemed to enjoy entertaining the lively Wyndham brood. In the middle of all the excitement was his 4-year-old sprite of a daughter, hopping up and down, dressed in a cut-down livery, dark red with yellow piping and tiny tan breeches. He had changed the livery when he became master at Oakley, and the old material had largely been put to other purposes. Robert had rescued this one from a rag bag somewhere. He had begged to have it as an army uniform, and Mariah herself had cut it down for him. His daughter was now preening in it as though it was a ball gown. He shook his head at her. Breeches. "Good day, Miss Ellie," he said, sweeping her up into his arms. "Or shall we call you Master Eli instead?" Elizabeth scowled, her face a black cloud.
Ellie is my name, Papa. I am Ellie.
"Very well, my girl," Wyndham said, placing a quick kiss on his daughter's forehead. He gazed at her little face, a tiny copy of her mother's. Large, dark eyes with long black eyelashes, a small, pouty mouth, cherry red lips, a delicate little nose, long, dark curls. He sighed, knowing it was hopeless. He could deny her nothing.
Welcome home, Papa,
she said sweetly, with a little lisp.
Do you see my cats?
She pulled at a silver button decorated with a lion's head and patted the jacket proudly.
Robbie gived it to me.
"I am too big for it now, Papa," Robert said, his eyes dark and solemn. He'd recently turned 7 and took his role as the eldest very seriously. "I said Ellie could wear it." Wyndham set his daughter down on the floor, catching, as he did so, the grins on the older boys' faces. He frowned and silently wished them luck with their own children when they were grown. "Get on outside, then," he said gruffly, "and mind your cousins."
Oh, yes, Papa,
his son and daughter squealed. Robert took Ellie's hand, and they dashed out the front door, ahead of everyone else, Richard and William following, carrying a few shuttlecocks and rackets. Malcolm picked up little John and proceeded outside, the children's nurse trailing behind at a discreet distance. "What a troop," Wyndham said fondly. He informed Mariah that he would head upstairs to refresh himself after the long carriage ride. His negotiations in London had not gone well. She examined him for a moment.
Are you upset, Daniel? She asked.
He sighed. "No, Mariah, I am not," he told her with a wry smile. "I am, in fact, a very happy man."
"Fitzy, make me a crown,"
Elizabeth commanded, and Richard laughed. "Yes, Your Highness," he replied drolly, and offered his little cousin a deep bow. She giggled and clapped her hands. "However," he told her, "you must pick the flowers, for I do not know which ones you prefer." This sent Elizabeth on a chase through the woodland that bordered the lawn on one side of the house. She darted in and out of the trees, returning to him to drop flowers in a haphazard little pile. "This is a weed, Ellie," Richard called as she disappeared again, rolling a long green stem with small yellow flowers between his fingers. She did not respond, and he walked into the trees to find her.
"More flowers?"
Elizabeth asked as she pushed an armful of wildflowers into his hands, some with roots trailing soil.
Blue flowers."
He laughed and held out his hand. "All right, we have enough. Come with me." She skipped next to him until they were out onto the lawn, where she sat expectantly, singing softly to herself. Nearby, the other boys were playing shuttlecock. Every so often, one of them would hit it to Robert, who would swing wildly and sometimes connect. Eventually, William walked over, Robert trailing behind him. "What is taking you so long, Richard?" he asked, grinning. "Flower crowns more difficult than you anticipated?" Richard was nearly finished, his fingers fumbling with the delicate stems. "Anne taught me how to make these at Easter," he said, his eyes on his work. "I promised Ellie I would make her one, but I should have practiced more."
"Fitzy promised,"
Elizabeth said, with a nod of her head. She pointed.
"Or the yellow one?"
"That is a weed, Ellie," Richard repeated. Elizabeth just continued to gaze at him, and he sighed. "Fine." He plucked the yellow flower from the stem and tucked it into the crown. Elizabeth smiled.
"Pretty Fitzy,"
she said happily. "That was very sweet of you, Pretty Fitzy," called Malcolm with a laugh. "A sweet name for a sweet boy."
"No, you do not call him that."
Elizabeth crossed her arms over her chest and scowled at her older cousin. "Am I not allowed?" Malcolm asked, a warm smile lighting up his face.
"No,"
Elizabeth told him bluntly.
"only me, or Fitzy will punch you. Right, Fitzy?"
"I am not afraid of him, Ellie," Malcolm said, still smiling. Elizabeth stuck her bottom lip out in a pout, and even William smiled.
"You be afraid,"
she insisted, balling up her tiny hands and placing them on her hips. Richard's eyes met his brother's, flower crown still in his hands. "You might win that fight, Mal," he said calmly, "but you would know you had been in one. Leave off. You appear stupid baiting a little girl." "My apologies, Miss Wyndham," Malcolm told her and made her a grand bow. Elizabeth smiled brightly and, tipping her head to one side, chirped,
"I forgive you."
"There!" Richard exclaimed suddenly. "Shall I put it in your hair, Princess?" Elizabeth nodded several times. When she stilled, Richard placed a flimsy but colourful ring of small pink and blue flowers on her head. "Well done, Princess Ellie," William told her. He turned to Robert. "Your sister is the very first princess ever to wear livery." Elizabeth frowned.
"Robbie said I could."
Her brother nodded his support. "And it is very nice," Richard assured her, giving William a dirty look. William lifted his shoulders and let them fall, then crouched in front of her and pretended to examine the flowers in detail. "These are forget-me-nots. My mother likes them too." He paused and nodded sagely. "You know what would make this crown perfect?" he asked Elizabeth. She shook her head, curls bobbing. "If you had a princess dress to go with it." Her eyes widened. Carefully, she lifted the crown from her head and placed it in Richard's outstretched hands.
"Hold that,"
she ordered before she flew back towards the house, little red leather shoes flashing bright in the late afternoon sun. Fitzwilliam Darcy would never forget the sound of Richard's shout. It was loud, of course, and angry, but the fear that ripped through the single word sent a frozen shock to his very heart. "No!" Richard cried and began to run. "No!" He and Malcolm turned back toward the house to follow Richard's movement, and then they saw it too. The nurse, who had been following Elizabeth back to the house, was holding young John tightly. She finally let out a shriek, but it was weak, and the woman seemed unable to move. Before her, heading their way, but slightly to the west, was a masked man galloping away on a large, powerful black horse. He held the reins tightly in one hand. His other arm was wrapped around a wriggling Ellie Wyndham. Malcolm tossed Robert over his shoulder and raced back to the house as the little boy screamed for his sister. Richard was chasing the horse down the approach, but it was already past him, and William knew it was hopeless. He whirled around to glare at the woods that covered this side of the property, remembered there was a stream and a field beyond. The road wound down for a half-mile before it turned to the south. If they cut across the field... "Richard!" he yelled, and darted away. He dodged trees and roots, skidded down a soft bank and jumped over the stream, then clambered up the other side. Lungs burning, he burst through the woods into a brown field. He never stopped, his legs and arms pumping hard, breaths coming in quick gasps. As he reached the center of the field, heading toward the far end, he caught the rider out of the corner of his eye. He took a huge breath of air and increased his speed. His feet hit the hard ground of the road just as the horse was racing past about 6 feet away. It shied and reared, and William took advantage of the moment to stretch his arms out and lunge. Time slowed as Elizabeth reached her small arms out to him. He nearly had one of her hands. and then she was jerked away roughly, and William grabbed nothing but air, bounced off the horse's rear flank, and landed unceremoniously on his back in the dust of the road. Before William could recover, they were out of his reach, hurtling down the road, leaving him on his knees and gulping for air. He was only barely aware that Richard had arrived and was bent over at the waist, huffing and puffing next to him. All he could hear were the horse's hooves beating against the dry ground as it drew farther away. He felt Richard's hand on his shoulder and turned his face up to meet his cousin's tortured gaze. He'd been so close. But Ellie was gone. Near Cambridge, summer 1796. The rain was falling heavily when Thomas Bennet knocked on the door of Matthias Tumbley. The man had been his tutor at Corpus Christi, but wishing to marry, had accepted first a curacy and then a living just outside of Cambridge. The door flew open to reveal a stout man of average height with ruddy cheeks and not much older than Bennet himself. "There you are, Thomas. Come in out of the rain," he cried, putting one hand on Bennet's shoulder and pulling him inside. "Come in, come in." As he shed his outerwear, Bennet caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror that hung in the hall. He had always been thin. His hair was still dark, but had begun to recede, and his troubles were clearly marked in the lines on his face. He appeared much older than he was. He felt it, too. Tumbley led him to a small but comfortable sitting room in the back of the house, where the windows overlooked a tiny garden. He could see that many of the flowers and plants in the garden were meant for the still room. There were also neat rows of what he suspected were vegetables. He thought he spied carrot tops, onions, and potatoes. Several cherry and pear trees lined the back wall. Inside, the scent of freshly cut roses perfumed the air. Everything was beauty and utility combined. "Ah," Tumbley said, handing Bennet a drink. "I see you admire our little farm." He smiled fondly. "My wife and I tend it together, and have passed many happy hours there." He sat next to Bennet and stretched his feet out toward the fire. "So, now you will tell me what brings you all this way to visit in such dreadful weather, my friend." It was not a question. "I hardly know where to begin," Bennet said, staring into his glass of wine. "I am tempted to do something I know to be wrong, Matthias, but I can see no other way. Is it sinful to do the wrong thing for the right reason?" The question hung in the air for a time before Tumbley leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I think you are not here for a philosophical discussion, Thomas. You will have to tell me what precisely has brought you to me today." Bennet grimaced. "My wife and children bring me here." "Ah, yes, you mentioned Fanny was expecting." Tumbley's expression did not change. He sipped his wine. "She had such a difficult time with Jane that we did not think she would be able to have another." Tumbley nodded. "A blessing, then." Bennet closed his eyes. "Matthias, I prayed for a boy, begged for a boy, not only to secure the Bennet line at Longbourn, but for the safety of my family. Collins remains obsessed with inheriting, though he is not the heir presumptive. We have managed to keep him away, although now—" He withdrew a letter from his coat pocket and proffered it to Tumbley. As his friend read the missive, his lips pressed together in a hard line. "As far as you know, then, James is missing. He has not been killed. It takes so long to receive letters from India that he might already be safely back with his regiment." Tumbley handed the letter back. "Has he married?" Bennet took the letter and shook his head. "I do not believe so. Neither of us are particularly regular correspondents, though James certainly has the better excuse." He sat. My brother left home when he was 18 and has never returned. I've buried both our parents and 2 of my children since that day. It seems a lifetime. And last month—" He stumbled over his words and came to a stop. "Last month," Tumbly prompted. "Fanny had a girl," Bennet replied, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I know it is a blessing, Matthias, I do see that. But it was so difficult with Jane, and worse yet this time. It is unlikely Fanny shall fall with child again. After 5 years, well, we were shocked." He sighed heavily. "Fanny was certain it was a sign that this child would be our heir. We prayed for a boy, but God did not answer us." Tumbly sighed and set down his glass. "He did answer you, Thomas. He said no." "Why?" Bennet cried, standing abruptly and surprising himself with the bitterness he heard in the word. "Collins is a monster, Matthias. He claims to be a man of God, but he is deeply avaricious, even evil. How can I leave my family at the mercy of that man?" He felt a hand on his arm. "You do not need to leave them at his mercy, Thomas," Tumbly replied, his face a mask of confusion. "You earn a great deal of money on that estate of yours. If Collins really is to inherit, you must save against that day so that they will be able to live well and out of his reach." Bennet felt a wave of shame crest over him. "Matthias has created abundance from little. We squander our abundance without thought." "We have never been able to save," Bennet muttered. "Fanny spends to make herself feel better, but there are not enough funds in the world for that." "Come," Tumbly said, standing to join him. "Let us share a meal with Sarah before you head back to the city. You will be surprised at how Cambridge has grown since you were a young man here." "Do you not wish to hear my question, Matthias?" Bennet inquired. "If it is whether or not you ought to do something to defeat the entail," Tumbly replied, "I do not think you need to hear my reply. You know what is right." He opened the door. "You would not be my friend otherwise." Thomas Bennet thought long and hard about Matthias's advice as he watched the bedraggled, barefoot boy tucked into a ball on the backward-facing bench of his carriage. He was a comely little fellow, dressed in some sort of worn livery, with impossibly tiny breeches. He was young enough that he still had his curls. It lifted Bennet's heart and made him smile, though he also felt the first stirrings of guilt as he recalled Matthias's advice. This feeling was not enough, however, to make him wish to turn the horses around and return to Cambridge. "You will have a good life with us," he said to the boy's sleeping form. "I promise you that much." Chapter 2. Longbourn, Summer 1796. Thomas Bennet poured himself a glass of wine and toasted his fortune. He had entered Longbourn, carrying the still sleeping boy in his arms, explaining in a hushed whisper to his wife and a few members of his staff that this was his brother's child, sent to them for safekeeping. Fanny had seen the advantage at once. Instead of cavilling, as he had feared she might, she merely kissed him on the cheek and returned to her chamber. The good Lord had smiled upon them, and his family was safe. When, not 30 minutes later, the maid returned to ask whether it would be suitable to have some of Miss Bennet's old dresses fitted for the newcomer, he was baffled. When the maid had said enough that he understood that the boy was a girl, his hands began to shake. He tucked them behind his back and ordered the maid to do what was required. After he was sure the servant had gone, he staggered to his desk and sat heavily in his chair. How could everything have gone so wrong? He knew, of course he did. He had eschewed Matthias's good advice and had reaped his reward. It would be folly to try to send the girl away now. He had announced her as his brother's child. It would not do in any case. He recognized what had happened. He had chosen the wrong course, and this girl was to be his penance, a constant reminder of his folly. He shook his head and chuckled softly, trying to ignore the sorrow in the laugh. He ought to have known. Matthias had attempted to warn him. One did not sport with God and come away the victor. The hubris, he whispered to himself in the empty room. He lifted his wine glass in a toast. Well played, Lord. Oakley Manor, September 1796. Daniel Wyndham sat alone in his study and stared at the fire crackling in the hearth. He had done everything he could to recover his little girl. His men had followed the horseman within the hour, but she was gone. They suspected the man who had abducted little Miss Wyndham had given her to someone in a carriage, or possibly a wagon. The door creaked as it opened. Wyndham? It was his brother, the Earl. Matlock's brother Darcy followed him into the room. Daniel grimaced. Matlock remained because their wives were sisters. Ellie had in fact been named for Matlock's wife, Elizabeth, who was her godmother. Darcy was a friend, but not family. He had a recovering wife and a new babe of his own at home. It had been a month since Ellie disappeared. There was no need for Darcy to linger here under some honourable but unnecessary sense of obligation. He forced himself to his feet. "Gentlemen, I must face facts," he said. He felt ill and grabbed the edge of the desk to steady himself. "Elizabeth is gone. The men who took her have their money, but she has not been returned. I should be a fool to continue to believe she has not been. His voice faltered. He could not bring himself to say the words. Certainly his daughter was gone. Most likely she had been killed in short order, perhaps even before the ransom demand was sent. What care would such men have for a small child who would only slow them down? "They might at least have told us where to find her," he said quietly. "She should be home with us." Darcy shifted uncomfortably. "Wyndham, have you thought more on who might have wished you ill?" He nodded. "I think it most likely was Gravesend. He believes his father left him the timber on the north side of the estate. He claims it is on his land, despite the boundary maps showing it is on mine. I kept his men from harvesting the oaks." He passed a hand across his face. "The ransom was very near the value of the property." He lifted his shoulders and let them fall. "Yet he has vehemently denied it, and I have no proof." Matlock nodded. "You have a disagreement with your cousin Holloway as well?" "He wanted my investment in the canal, but he wanted too much. It will take years to see any returns." He sat heavily. "It will run near to him at Leicester." "Anyone else?" "Parnell wanted me to work on my cousin William over the enclosure of Whitting Commons, and was bitter when I declined." Wyndham leaned back, agitated. "I should just have written the damned letter." He removed a paper from his desk and held it out. He met Matlock's eye. "This is a list of 5 men who might have been involved, but it might be someone I do not even know. I am often asked whether I am the William Wyndham who serves in the House of Lords, and I am not always believed when I say that I am not." Matlock frowned. "Your cousin William has many enemies in Parliament." He felt numb. "I know." Longbourn, autumn 1796. Elizabeth sat at breakfast longer than was her wont. The day was sunny and warm for the time of year, and Aunt Bennet eventually insisted they go out of doors to relieve her nerves. The girls moved out beyond the garden and the home farm to the stream. They spoke of baby Mary, and Elizabeth mentioned her brother John was 2 years old. Jane gave her a reproving look.
Papa says that John must be a boy you met on the ship. Was he nice?
Elizabeth's lips drew down in a scowl.
He is my brother.
Jane's brows pinched together.
Oh, did you not say that Robbie was your brother? He is.
Elizabeth folded her arms across her chest.
They both are.
Jane smiled.
I see,
She said in a mild voice that made Elizabeth want to stamp her feet. She hoisted herself up on a boulder and gazed out on the water unhappily. She kicked her heels against the rock, first one, then the other.
You will ruin your shoes.
Jane warned.
Mamma will be upset.
Elizabeth gazed unhappily at her dull brown shoes. The dragon man had taken her pretty red ones. She sighed noisily and stopped swinging her legs. She dropped to the ground and strolled to the water's edge. She plucked a long piece of grass and placed it on the water, watching it as it floated away. At home, she would have been invited to eat in the breakfast room instead of the nursery. Papa might even carry her downstairs, and there would be a little cake on her plate. Mamma would have sung a song just for her. Robbie would be especially nice to her all day long, but then Robbie was always nice to her. Did Uncle Bennet even know it was her birthday? Papa should have told him. But Papa was in India, wherever that was, and Uncle Bennet did not know about Mamma or Robbie or John or Fitzy or Mal or even Willem. 2 fat tears ran hot over her cheeks, and she rubbed at them with the back of her hand. She wanted to go home, but they all thought she was telling a story. Everyone was kind to her here, but nobody ever listened. Oakley Manor, Autumn 1796. "When is Ellie coming home, Mamma?" Robert asked, not for the first time. Mariah stroked his hair.
I do not know, darling.
Mariah Wyndham tucked her boys in and kissed each good night, taking a final glance back at them before the nurse extinguished the candles. In the aftermath of her daughter's loss, Mariah had spent her nights in the nursery, away from her husband. One night, perhaps a month after the search for Elizabeth had ceased, she apologized to Daniel. In return, he confessed his belief that she did not wish to remain in the bed of a man who had failed to protect their children. It had taken a great deal of persuasion on her part to convince him that she did not blame him, but rather could not bear to be so far away from her babies. To comfort her, he had suggested moving the nursery to the same floor as their chambers, and she had gratefully agreed. They were still finding their way back to one another. Unlike her husband, Mariah had not given up hope that her daughter lived. She refused to accept condolence calls. She refused to erect a stone in the churchyard. She refused to accept any hint that her child had been taken from them in a permanent way. She continued to purchase things Elizabeth might need when she returned. She spoke to her boys about their sister as a living little girl out in the world. It pained Daniel, she knew, but in this she could not oblige him. Elizabeth was alive, she was certain. For if her daughter had passed from this world to the next, she would have felt it. She was Elizabeth's mother. She would have known. Oakley Manor, November 1798. Daniel Wyndham paced in the hallway outside his wife's chambers, listening to her cries. She had been laboring for 18 hours. Ellie's birth had taken longer. Ellie. The very name was a shot to his heart. 2 years and more, yet the pain had not abated. She would have been 6 now, and eagerly awaiting a sister, he was sure of it. He both hoped and feared that this child would be a girl, hoped it might ease Mariah's pain somewhat to have another girl to raise, feared that he would forever be seeing her sister in another pair of trusting eyes. Perhaps it would be better if the baby were a boy. Mariah kept the doll Elizabeth had always slept with on the shelf in the nursery when he would rather have put it away. He knew he would never forget his second child, but to his shame, he wished that he could. When at last his sister emerged to tell him that Mariah and the babe were well, he felt the familiar relief overtake him, and he stepped towards the door. Mariah was waiting for him. He sat beside her on the bed and leaned in to kiss her one cheek.
Mercy.
She whispered in his ear.
Her name is Mercy.
Longbourn, winter 1798. Elizabeth sat up suddenly. The bedclothes fell to her waist, and she grabbed them up again. Two men had been arguing, one telling the other to leave and then disappearing. The remaining man's face, red with anger, had hovered over her. He was angry with her for running away and forcing them to stop. He kept hitting her as he screamed something she did not understand. Rough hands ripped her shoes and stockings off. She curled her feet beneath her. She waited for her heart to stop racing and blinked the dream away. It was very cold, and she did not like to sleep alone. Robbie and John were not in the nursery here, only Mary, who was a baby. Uncle Bennet had said she might sleep with Jane instead. It was warmer than sleeping alone.
Lizzie?
Jane asked sleepily, rubbing her eyes.
What is it? I miss my mamma and papa and Robbie,
Elizabeth said stoutly. She even missed John, though he was too little to play with her.
I want to go home.
Jane yawned.
You cannot return to India, Lizzie,
she said patiently.
It is too far.
She closed her eyes. Elizabeth scratched her ear. Jane always said that, but was she from India? Christopher Lucas had asked about life on a ship, and she was sure she had never been on one. Uncle Bennet said she had, though.
There were trees and a big house,
she said, willing the pictures not to float away.
Fitzy made me a flower crown.
She pursed her lips.
Willem said I could be a princess, but a bad night took me away, and a dragon man hurt me.
She shivered. Next to her, she heard Jane's soft, slow breathing. Nobody ever believed her when she talked about Mamma and Papa and Robbie. She still spoke about Fitzy, who protected her, and Willem, who had reached for her, and even Mal, who was very tall and sometimes let her ride on his shoulders. They laughed when she talked about the bad night on a black horse and the dragon whose face was so red. Sometimes they patted her on the head. Elizabeth laid back on her pillows and curled around Jane's warm body.
They are real,
she whispered as she closed her eyes.
They are.
Near Leicester, autumn 1799. I see the canal is doing well, cousin, Daniel Wyndham acknowledged as they walked to the stables on Hiram Holloway's property. Is it bringing any dividends? Holloway scratched his protruding stomach and shook his head. It will eventually, but the debt was deep by the time it was complete, and that shall have to be cleared first. You were wise not to invest. Robert walked behind them as they talked. All his father and Mr. Holloway had done since they arrived was discuss business. He did not like Mr. Holloway. He always laughed too hard at Papa's jokes, and he smelled bad. There was another fizzing sound and foul air escaping Mr. Holloway's breeches. Robert wrinkled his nose. Mamma had warned him not to laugh, but Mr. Holloway broke wind in their company over and over. How was he not supposed to laugh? He felt a hand on his shoulder, and he jumped, hoping he had not been found out. His cousin Malcolm pulled a face. Robert bit back the laughter rising in his throat and elbowed his grown-up cousin. I do not wish to be called to accounts with Papa, he whispered. Malcolm patted him on the back and nodded. Robert was glad his cousin the Viscount was joining them on their business to London. He had returned from Cambridge over the summer and had visited Oakley shortly after to see how they all got on. After this short visit to Mr. Holloway, he and Papa were to stay with the Earl and Countess, who were still in London. They would be in town for a fortnight, and then they would all travel back to Derbyshire together. It would be his first trip to town, and the privilege had come with a great many rules to follow. Malcolm joined the other men, leaving Robert standing behind them to entertain himself. A young girl was handing a slightly older stable boy a packet, likely his noonday meal. He was distracted by the red leather shoes she was wearing. Ellie had owned a pair just like them, and his mind wandered to his missing sister. They never talked about her anymore, though he often caught his mother going into the room she had decorated in anticipation of Ellie's return. She would be 8 now, he thought. The men were deep into a conversation in which Robert had no interest. He kept sending glances over in the girl's direction. She was sitting with her brother now. As he continued to consider the situation, it seemed strange that a girl whose brother was a stable boy would own such a pair of shoes. They really did look just like Ellie's. "Papa," he finally said, "that girl over there." He motioned with his head. "Her shoes." At first his father was annoyed at the interruption, but when he saw what the girl was wearing, he froze in place. Malcolm turned just after his father, and Robert heard a shallow, sharp intake of breath. "Ellie was wearing a pair just like those when—" He paused, knowing his father would not wish to be reminded, but thought he should explain. "I remember them because she spilled a little ink on the toe of one when I was trying to teach her how to use a quill." Robert's lips quirked up just a bit. "She was upset, but I told her it looked like a star, and that made her happy." He was not sure his father had heard him. Mr. Holloway was saying something disparaging and trying to leave, but Malcolm held him tightly by the arm. Robert was impressed. He had not realized his cousin was so strong. His face turned to his father's. Papa met his gaze steadily, then nudged him forward. Together they approached the girl. "What pretty shoes," his father said gently, crouching down before her. "May I see them?" The girl, small and thin, with yellow braids, silently stuck out her feet. On the toe of the right shoe was a tiny starburst of black ink. His father touched it lightly with the tip of his finger. "Where did you find these shoes, boy?" his father asked the stable boy. The boy, no older than Robert himself, coughed and shifted, anxious. "In the old gatekeeper's cottage by the road, sir." His father's lips pressed together before he asked, "On the property here?" "Yes, sir," replied the boy, his face pale beneath a scattering of freckles. "The place was all dusty and musty, but these shoes was tossed under the bed and covered in dust. I thought my sister—" "You are not in trouble," Papa reassured him, glancing up at last. "I will have new shoes made for your sister, but I will need to take these with me," he said hoarsely. "They belonged to my daughter, you see, and her mother will want them back." The boy nodded, his eyes wide and fearful. His father straightened and slowly turned back to face Mr. Holloway. Papa's face was as cold as Robert had ever seen it, his shoulders tense, his hands clenched into fists. In a voice that was almost eerily calm, he asked, "Young man, does your sister have an old pair of shoes she can wear for now?" "Yes, sir," was the response. "Just a bit small, but she can wear 'em." "Robert," his father said, a brittle smile on his face, "will you walk these two back home and retrieve Ellie's shoes?" Robbie thought his father might be ill, for his face was very pale, but he recovered quickly. "We will stop in at the cobbler's on the way home and pay for a new pair to be made for the young miss. Tell her mother to take her when they are next in the village." He nodded. The stable boy grabbed his sister by the hand and led Robert down a path beyond the stables. They had only taken a few steps when Robert heard an agonized shout and some muffled thumps. He asked the other two to wait and hurried back towards the noise, concealing himself behind a hedge 20 feet away. Malcolm had Holloway's arms pinned behind him.
"Where is my daughter, you traitorous bastard?"
Papa nearly howled as he rammed a fist into Holloway's stomach and the man doubled over.
"Where is she?"
Holloway caught his breath enough to cry out,
"I swear, I do not know."
Papa hit Mr. Holloway again, this time in the face. There was blood on his hand when he pulled it away. Robert's fingers tingled and an icy cold began to spread through his chest. Mr. Holloway took Ellie.
"Where is she, Hiram?"
his father shouted, grabbing Mr. Holloway's lapel in one hand and throwing a downward punch with the other.
"Where?"
Mr. Holloway was sobbing, and Robert grimaced at the exhibition. Men should not cry, not ever.
"She was supposed to be left with your solicitor in London,"
Mr. Holloway choked out.
"But they never arrived. I swear it was just the money. It should only have been a week. I never meant—"
Malcolm hauled the man up out of the dirt just as Papa whipped his booted foot between Holloway's legs. The man shrieked and collapsed. Malcolm let him fall, and Mr. Holloway lay still in the dust and dried horse droppings, curled up like a dog before a fire. Malcolm looked up suddenly and met Robert's eyes. His cousin's face was grim and drawn. He shook his head once and jerked his chin upward. Robert knew he was being told to leave. Reluctantly, he did. Bombay, January 1800. Dear Thomas, if you have heard reports of my demise, you must now disregard them. I am alive and at last back with my regiment. Fortunately, neither you nor I send many letters. Father's influence, I fear. It has made reviewing my correspondence easier. The story of my capture and the number of captors through whose lands I have passed will require more time to tell than I currently possess. The conclusion of the sad business was a rather brilliant lie. I claimed to belong to the Bennet Israel caste. I was sent to the Gate of Mercy Temple in Bombay and released to 2 Englishmen, Samuel and Isaac Ezekiel. I would ask that you add them to your prayers, Thomas. Without the story of how they had survived their own capture and their willingness to affirm my tale, the British victory over Mysore would have made little difference to me, and you would no longer have your spare. As it is, you need not fear that Collins will inherit. Although this comes several years too late, you are of course encouraged to make free with my name to secure your young charge a favourable future. There is no need for an apology to me. I no longer care for ridiculous English notions of propriety. I am not married, and as I expect that you shall live to a ripe old age, there is no need for me to return to England. To tell the truth, in all the colour and heat and humanity of India, it is sometimes difficult to believe that a cool green place like England even exists. I am sorry to end with a request for a favour of my own, Thomas, but needs must. My horse is long gone, and it is damned difficult to find another as fine. I am owed my back pay, but knowing the army as I do, it might be years before I see a farthing. I do not know how you fare at Longbourn, brother, but I have purchased a mount on the line of credit Father established for me, and I hope you will honour it. I have other correspondence to complete, but I will write again when I have information about where we are to be posted. Until then, I am your dutiful brother, Captain J. Bennet, 19th Light Dragoons.